There was a moment, standing in the kitchen of my lake house at 5 in the morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist roll off the water, when I thought my life had finally found its rhythm again. 3 years after Eleanor passed, I had stopped waking up reaching for her side of the bed. I had stopped setting 2 cups instead of 1. The lake house had become mine again. Not ours, not theirs, not anyone else's. Mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I built this place with my own hands. Not metaphorically. I mean, I drove the posts, I poured the concrete footings, I laid every plank of the wraparound porch with a crew of 3 and a bad back that complained every single morning. Eleanor had found the land, a 3-acre lot on the western shore of Lake Carver in Minnesota, tucked behind a stand of white birch that turned gold every October like something out of a painting. She said the first time she saw it, she cried. I said that was a strange reaction to a piece of land. She said I had no poetry in my soul. She was probably right. We broke ground the summer our son graduated high school. We finished it 3 years later. It appraised at just under $1 million the last time I checked, which still makes me shake my head because I remember buying the lumber on credit and eating a lot of sandwiches to make the payments. Eleanor used to joke that every room had a story. The guest bathroom was the summer I threw out my shoulder. The back deck was the year we almost ran out of money. The master bedroom, with its window facing east over the water, was the year we finally stopped worrying. She died in February on a morning not unlike this one. Quiet, cold light coming through that east window. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand what this place means to me before I tell you what my son-in-law tried to do with it. His name is Brandon. He married my daughter, Claire, 7 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of Stillwater that cost more than my first car. I paid for half of it and smiled the whole time because Claire was radiant and happy, and I thought, standing there watching her walk toward a man who looked at her like she was the answer to something, that Eleanor would have wept through the entire ceremony. Brandon seemed decent enough back then. Firm handshake, remembered your name, told a good story at the rehearsal dinner. I did not yet know that Brandon's primary talent in life was identifying what other people had worked for, and finding ways to position himself adjacent to it. It started small, a comment here and there about the lake house, how convenient it was, how much his colleagues would love it, how it was a shame to leave a property like that sitting empty during the summer when people could be enjoying it. I let those comments pass. I was still grieving, and I had learned that grieving men say less and regret less. Then, Claire called me in April. She sounded careful, the way she sounds when she is relaying someone else's request and trying to make it sound like her own idea. She said Brandon had been talking about hosting a team retreat. Just some colleagues, she said. Maybe 8 or 10 people. Just for a long weekend. She said they would, of course, take care of everything and leave it just as they found it. She said it would mean a lot to Brandon professionally. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for about 4 minutes, and then I called her back and said no. I was sorry, but I wasn't comfortable with people I didn't know in the house. And that had nothing to do with Brandon personally. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. Then she said she'd tell him. I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was out on the porch reading. I didn't recognize the number at first, and then I heard his voice and I understood why he hadn't called from his usual cell. Brandon said without any preamble at all that he had gone ahead and sent out the invitations. I put my book down. I said, "I'm sorry. What invitations?" He said the retreat invitations. He said he had told people about the lake house and they were all extremely excited. He said there would be 14 people arriving Friday. This Friday. 4 days away. He said they would need the master bedroom cleared out. He used the word cleared out because he needed the king bed for himself and Claire. He said the other rooms should have clean linens. He said he assumed there was a kayak somewhere, and if I had a boat, even better. He said they'd be staying through Sunday, and I didn't need to worry about food because they would handle that, though if I had any good wine in the cellar, I should leave it out. Then he said, and I want you to understand, he said this in a tone that someone uses when they are doing you a favor by allowing you to be part of their plan. He said, You can stay too if you want, but honestly, we'll probably be pretty loud, and you'd probably be more comfortable at a hotel. I was 63 years old, sitting on the porch of a house I had built with my own hands, on land my wife had found and loved, being told I could stay in my own home if I wanted. But honestly, a hotel would probably be more comfortable for me. I did not raise my voice. Eleanor always said I was most dangerous when I was quiet. I said, let me make sure I understand. You sent invitations to 14 people to come to my house this Friday, without asking me. He said, I figured after the conversation with Claire you'd come around. It's a big house, George. It's just sitting there. I said, and you need the master bedroom cleared out. He said, king bed, yeah. Appreciate it. I said, I'll tell you what, Brandon. You go ahead and plan your retreat? He paused. He said, really? I said, really. I'll handle everything on my end. He made a sound that might have been a thank you and hung up quickly, probably before I could change my mind. I sat on that porch for a long time after the call. The mist was gone by then. The lake was flat and silver in the afternoon light. There was a loon calling somewhere across the water, that long, wavering call that sounds like a question with no answer. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she would say. I suspected she would say something quiet and devastating in that way she had, and then she would ask me what I was going to do about it. I thought about that for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has been handling my affairs for 11 years. She is 70 years old and operates with the calm efficiency of a person who has seen most of what human beings are capable of and is no longer surprised by any of it. I told her what Brandon had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I assume you're not actually going to let him use the house. I said, no, but I'm not going to stop him either. Another pause. Then she said, tell me what you're thinking. I told her. She was quiet through the whole thing. At the end, she said, you know this is going to be complicated. I said I knew. She said, you know Claire is going to be upset. I said I knew that too. She said, all right, let me draw up the paperwork. I want to explain something because I suspect some of you are wondering the same thing my attorney wondered, which is why not just tell him no? Why not have a lawyer send a letter? Why not simply lock the door and be done with it? Here's the truth. If I had said no on that phone call, Brandon would have played the victim. He would have told the story of the unreasonable father-in-law who refused to share a property that was just sitting empty. He would have told that story to Claire, to his colleagues, to anyone who would listen. He had a gift for that kind of narrative, for positioning himself as the reasonable one in a room full of unreasonable people. Claire, who loved him, who had built a life with him, would have been caught in the middle of a story where I was the difficult one. I did not want to be the difficult one. I wanted Brandon to be the difficult one. I wanted everyone who mattered to see it clearly, without any possibility of reinterpretation. And beyond that, and this is the part I thought about most on that porch, Claire deserved to see who she had married, not through my eyes, through her own. The next 4 days were the busiest I had in years. The first thing I did was make some calls. Lake Carver is not a large community. I had known most of my neighbors for 20 years, some longer. I called Robert and Linda next door, who had a vacation rental themselves and understood how these things worked. I explained the situation. Robert laughed for about 45 seconds and then said, "What do you need?" I called a property management company in Brainerd that I had dealt with twice before. I explained that I needed to list my property for a short-term rental, effective the following weekend, and that I expected interested parties to come by for a walkthrough that Friday evening. The woman I spoke to, a no-nonsense person named Diane, said she could have the listing up by Thursday, and yes, she could arrange showings. I told her there might be some disruption during the showing. She said she had seen disruption before. Then I walked through the house, room by room. I took Eleanor's things down. Her paintings, the ones she had made in her watercolor phase in her 50s, came down from the living room wall. I wrapped each one carefully and carried them up to the storage room at the top of the house. Her pottery collection. She had taken a class at the community center and had gotten genuinely good at it, better than she knew. I packed in paper and put in boxes. Her reading chair, the blue one by the east window, with the permanent impression of her shape in the cushion. I moved upstairs. I took down the photographs. This part was hard. Not because I was sad, exactly, though I was. It was hard because each thing I moved was a kind of conversation. Eleanor had chosen that painting for that wall for a reason. She had placed that pottery on that shelf in that order for a reason. Taking it down felt like erasing a decision she had made, and I had spent 3 years trying to preserve those decisions. But I reminded myself that I was not erasing them. I was protecting them. There is a difference. By Thursday, the main living areas look different. Still beautiful. The bones of the house are good. The lake view through the great room windows is something you cannot diminish, but personal. The things that made it mine, that made it Eleanor's, were put away. What remained was what Brandon had called just sitting there. Furniture, floors, walls, a view. Let him have just sitting there. I also made a few adjustments. Nothing dramatic. The water heater, which I controlled through a smart home system I had installed 2 years prior, I set to a slightly unconventional schedule. Hot water would be available in the mornings from 6 to 7, and in the evenings from 5 to 6. Outside those windows, the water would be cool, not cold enough to be a health concern. Cool enough to be extremely unpleasant if you were expecting a long hot shower in the middle of the afternoon. The Wi-Fi router had a guest network that could be managed remotely. I left it on, but I set the bandwidth to the minimum available setting, which is technically functional and practically useless for 14 people trying to stream content or conduct anything that resembled work. The smart lock on the front door I reprogrammed with a code that would work Friday through Sunday as planned. The master bedroom, however, I locked with a separate deadbolt, an old-fashioned keyed lock I had installed years ago when we had contractors working. And I kept the key. Brandon had asked for the master bedroom cleared out. I cleared it of Eleanor's things, certainly. What I did not do was make it accessible. I called Claire on Thursday evening. She sounded pleased and a little surprised that things were moving forward. She said Brandon was really grateful. I said I was sure he was. I asked how she was doing. She said she was good, just busy. I said I was glad. I asked if she remembered the summer she was 11 and we had canoed the whole perimeter of the lake, just the two of us, and she had caught her first wally and cried because she felt bad for it and then named it Gerald before throwing it back. She laughed. She said she thought about that sometimes. I said I did too. I didn't tell her anything else. And that was a choice I made deliberately. I needed her to see it herself. Friday afternoon, they arrived. I was sitting on the dock when the first cars came down the gravel drive. Brandon had a white SUV, and he led a small convoy of other vehicles behind him. I counted them from the dock. 14 people, as promised, plus Claire, plus Brandon. 16 total. Brandon got out and stretched, and looked at the lake, and then looked at the house, and I could see, even from the dock, that he was performing the gesture of a man surveying his territory. He had his hands on his hips. He tilted his head back. He said something to the man standing next to him, and they both laughed. I came up from the dock slowly. I am 63, and my knees let me know about dock ladders in a way they did not 10 years ago. Brandon saw me, and his expression shifted into something professionally warm. He walked over and shook my hand firmly and said, "George, thanks again. This is going to be incredible." He said it loud enough for people nearby to hear. He wanted the credit for this. I said, glad it could work out. He introduced me to a few people. I shook hands and nodded. I was pleasant. I was exactly as pleasant as I needed to be. Then he said, "Should we do the tour?" I said, "Go ahead, make yourselves at home. I'll be on the dock." He seemed mildly surprised that I wasn't going to guide them. Then he shrugged and turned to the group and said, "All right, let's go see this place." And they moved toward the house in that loose, already comfortable way of people who believe they belong somewhere. I went back to the dock. I had a book I wasn't reading and a phone with Patricia's number at the top of my recent calls. It was approximately 11 minutes before Brandon came back out. He came across the lawn at a pace that was not quite running, but wanted to be. He said, "The master bedroom is locked." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, You said you'd clear it out. I said, I moved Eleanor's things out. The room itself is locked. He said, we need that room. I said, I know you do. Unfortunately, that room isn't part of what I'm making available. His face went through several expressions quickly. He settled on the one that was trying to stay reasonable in public. He said, George, I told people, he gestured at the house, these are colleagues, this is a professional thing. I told them there was a master suite. I said, that's a shame. He said, and his voice had an edge in it now, thin and sharp. He said, I need you to unlock that room. I looked at him for a moment. He was 41 years old, and he was standing in my yard, telling me he needed me to unlock my own room in my own house that he had invited himself to without asking. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the loon I had heard Tuesday afternoon. I said, I don't think I'm going to do that, Brandon. He stared at me. Then he turned and went back toward the house. Over the next 2 hours, things developed in the way that things develop when 14 people discover that their accommodations are not what they were promised. I could hear the conversations from the dock. Voices traveling across water have a way of carrying detail. There was some laughter at first, the social glue kind that people use to smooth over awkwardness. Then less laughter. Then Brandon's voice, louder than the others, working through explanations. Around 4 in the afternoon, I came inside to get a glass of water. The great room had the particular atmosphere of a gathering that is realized it is in a negotiation. People were on phones. Someone had opened a bottle of wine. Brandon was standing near the kitchen with 2 other men, speaking quietly in a way that stopped when I came through the door. I nodded pleasantly and went to the kitchen. One of Brandon's colleagues, a tall woman with a ponytail who had the direct manner of someone used to managing situations, came and stood near me and said, Is there anything we should know about the house? About how things work? I said, What do you mean? She said, The internet seems slow. I said, Mountain Lake, sometimes the service is inconsistent. She said, And there's no hot water right now. I said, The heater runs on a schedule. Should be fine by 5. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone assembling a picture. Then she said, I see. She went back to the group. At 5:15, Patricia called me. Not because anything had happened yet, just to confirm the timeline. She was calm and methodical in the way of someone who has prepared a document and intends to use it. At 6 o'clock, Diane from the property management company arrived with a young couple who were looking for a long-term summer rental. They were from the cities, early 30s, looking for a place for 3 months. Diane had called them that morning. I met them at the door. Diane introduced them as Michael and Sarah. They were pleasant, wide-eyed at the lake view, the kind of couple who would take good care of a place. Brandon appeared behind me almost immediately. He said, What is this? I said, I have some interested renters coming to look at the property. He said, Now? Well, he gestured at the people behind him. I said, Diane has their schedule. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. The look on Brandon's face in that moment is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was the look of a man who has been very certain about something and has just become uncertain. He said, You're listing the house? I said, I've been considering it for a while. Michael and Sarah were looking at the lake through the great room windows, politely pretending not to hear any of this. Diane had a professional expression that communicated nothing. Brandon lowered his voice. He said, George, we have an arrangement. I said, Do we? He said, You told me on the phone. I said, I told you I'd handle everything on my end. I did. He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to call Claire. I said, That's a good idea. She's actually on her way. He blinked. He said, What? I said, I called her this morning. I asked her to come by this evening. I thought she should see the property given that we're discussing its future use. He took out his phone and walked toward the back deck. I showed Michael and Sarah the kitchen. Claire arrived at 6:45. I heard her car on the gravel and went to the front door. She had Brandon's expression on her face, but a different version of it. Not the entitled one, the worried one. She said, Dad, what's going on? Brandon called me and I said, Come inside. I want to show you something. I took her through the main floor. She noticed immediately that Eleanor's paintings were gone. She stopped in the living room and looked at the bare walls, and I watched something move across her face. She said, "Where are Mom's paintings?" I said, "I put them upstairs." "Safe." She said, "Why?" I said, "I'll explain everything. But first, I want you to just be here for a few minutes." The great room had about 12 of Brandon's colleagues in it at that point, with the energy of people who have been surprised by circumstances and are not entirely sure how to proceed. 2 of them were helping themselves to more wine. 3 were outside on the deck. Someone's phone was playing music, slightly too loud for the size of the room. Claire stood at the edge of the great room and took it in. I watched her see it, really see it. The wine on Eleanor's table. The jackets tossed over Eleanor's chairs. The way the room that she had grown up treating as a sanctuary of her mother's things had become, in the span of a few hours, a rental house in the middle of a loud weekend. She said quietly, "He didn't ask you." It was not a question. I said, "He told me 4 days ago. He had already sent the invitations." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me you'd said yes. He told me you 2 had talked and you were fine with it." I said, "I know." She sat down on the arm of the couch. Not Brandon's colleague's couch, her mother's couch, which she had sat on 10,000 times in her life. She put her hand on the fabric the way you touch something familiar when you need to feel steady. Brandon came in from the back deck. He saw Claire and his expression reset into the reasonable one. He said, "Babe, I'm glad you're here. There's been some miscommunication." Claire looked at him. She had her mother's eyes. Eleanor always looked at me with those eyes when she needed me to know she was paying attention to everything. Claire said, "Did you ask him?" Brandon said, "We talked about it. There was a..." Claire said, "Did you ask him? Yes or no?" A pause. The music from someone's phone kept going. Brandon said, "I knew he'd say no if I asked directly. I figured once we were here it would be fine." Claire said nothing for a long moment. Patricia arrived at 7. I had asked her to come in person, which she had agreed to with the quiet willingness of someone who understood the value of presence. She had a folder with her. She shook my hand, nodded at Claire, and looked at Brandon with the expression of someone who has read a document about him. I introduced her as my attorney. Brandon's jaw tightened. Patricia said she had drawn up a formal notification of trespass, but she would be leaving with Brandon today. She said the property had never been formally offered for guest use, that no agreement had been made in writing or witnessed, and that continued occupation without the owner's explicit written consent constituted civil trespass under Minnesota statute. She said this calmly, the way she says everything. She also had a second document. She placed it on the table. She said this was a revocation of informal use rights, a formal acknowledgement for the record that no family member had standing use rights over the property, and that any future use would require written agreement signed by the owner. She looked at Brandon. She said, "You're welcome to have your own attorney review it before signing, but I'll need a response within 72 hours. The room was very quiet. Even the music had stopped. Someone had turned it off. I wasn't sure when. Brandon said, and his voice had gone thin in a way I'd not heard from him before. He said, "This is unbelievable. This is family." Patricia said, "Yes." He looked at me. He said, "You set this whole thing up." I said, "I handled things on my end." As I said I would, he looked at Claire. He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man who is hoping to find an ally and is not finding one. Claire said, "We should go." He said, "Claire," she said, "Brandon, we should go." She stood up from the arm of the couch. She walked to me and put her hand on my arm. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad." She said it quietly, just to me, with her mother's directness. I put my hand over hers. I said, "I know, sweetheart." She went to tell Brandon's colleagues that the weekend was ending early. She did it the way she does everything difficult, which is straightforwardly without drama. I have always been proud of that in her. I watched her do it and thought about the 11-year-old who cried over a Wally named Gerald, and the way certain qualities persist in people across decades. It took about 40 minutes for everyone to clear out. There was some grumbling. There was a moment near the door where Brandon stood very close to me and said, very quietly, that I had made things much harder than they needed to be. I looked at him. I said, "You called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me to clear out my bedroom in 4 days, and that I could stay in my own house if I wanted to, but a hotel would probably be more comfortable." He didn't say anything. I said, "You knew I would say no if you asked." "So you didn't ask. You told me after the fact and counted on the situation to move faster than my objections." "That's not a miscommunication, Brandon. That's a strategy." He left. I stood on the front porch and watched the last car go down the drive. The light was going by then. That long Minnesota summer light that hangs in the sky past 9 o'clock, like it doesn't want to leave. The lake had gone dark and still. The birches along the far edge of the property were just pale shapes in the dimming. I went inside and walked through the rooms. Someone had left a glass on Eleanor's table. I picked it up and took it to the kitchen. I wiped down the counter. I walked to the great room and stood at the window that faces the water. It was quiet. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet every other morning for 3 years. The good kind of quiet that is not absence but presence. The presence of every decision Eleanor had made about where to put a chair, which direction a painting should face, how a room should feel when you walk into it. Over the following week, Claire and I talked 3 times. Long conversations, the kind we had not had in a couple of years. She asked questions. I answered them honestly. She said she had known, on some level, that Brandon had a pattern of this kind of maneuvering. The fait accompli, the assumption that forgiveness is easier to obtain than permission, and that she had found ways to not look at it directly. She said, "I think I've been protecting a version of him that I want to be true." I said, "I know. I think your mother would understand that." She cried a little. I did too, quietly where she couldn't hear me. Brandon signed Patricia's document 10 days after the weekend, after his own attorney reviewed it and told him he had no basis for contesting it. He signed it without additional comment. 3 weeks later, Claire called to say she had asked Brandon to move out of their house while they worked things out with a counselor. She was not sure where things would land. She said she was trying to be honest with herself about what she actually wanted, which was different from what she had been telling herself she wanted. I said, "That sounds right." I said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." She said, "I know, Dad." The following October, she came up to the lake house for a week by herself. She slept in her old room. She kayaked every morning. She asked me one evening to tell her stories about her mother, and I talked for 3 hours, things I had not said out loud to anyone, details I had thought I was keeping only for myself. Before she left, she helped me bring Eleanor's paintings back down. We hung them carefully, the 2 of us taking turns on a stepladder, arguing mildly about whether the large one over the fireplace was level. It was level. She had inherited her mother's eye for things like that. When the last one was up, she stepped back and looked at the walls and said, "There, that's right." I stood beside her and looked at Eleanor's paintings in Eleanor's light and thought about everything it had taken to get back to that exact arrangement, those exact decisions, that exact room. I said, "Yes, that's right. Some things are worth protecting with patience. Some lessons can only be taught by letting people walk all the way into the consequences of their own choices. And some houses are not just property. They are the accumulated decisions of someone you loved, hanging on the walls in the particular light of the particular window on a lake in Minnesota, waiting for you to come back and remember. That is what I protected. That is what I was always protecting. And standing there with my daughter in the quiet of that house, with the lake going silver outside the window and Eleanor's paintings exactly where she had put them, I thought, yes, it was worth every bit of it.